Hi, and thanks for joining me. This story I wrote about Mrs. Ireland is one that's very near and dear to my heart, and I hope you'll find the same joy and inspiration in it that I did. So here we go. It's called What Mrs. Ireland Taught Me. It was somewhere around the time I was starting out on my road to making a full recovery from MS. Somewhere between the time when I was getting strong enough to leave the safety of my house and venturing out under my own steam with only the help of my cane. It had taken me for what seemed like forever just to reach this degree of achievement, and I felt like a champ for just having come this far. It was a long way from having been bedridden half the time. I was still very fragile and easily exhausted. Walking just the short distance down the driveway to the mailbox and then turning around to go back to the house again was no easy feat by any means. But in spite of the fact that MS still held its grip on me, my goal to make it all the way around the block someday on my own had become a self-imposed marathon I was determined to master. I'd heard about Mrs. Ireland and knew she lived alone in the old white house just around the corner. Not a far distance for most, but for me back then, it might as well have been miles away. A long-time widow now, she and her husband raised 3 boys in that old white house that had stood the test of time and now showed signs of age and disrepair, but a monument nevertheless to better days. It was a living testimony to her family life that thrived in a simpler, happier, less complicated time, when doors were never locked and walks to the beach with lunch packed in a wicker picnic basket were frequent events as she and her boys strolled carefree down the dirt road that bordered her home to spend summer afternoons on the ocean shore. Only remnants of that dirt road remain now, most of it having been destroyed, cut short long ago by housing developers. And now, at 91 years old, she was left alone to tend to the business of caring for her treasure trove of memories, preserving and cherishing them as best she could. And then one day, I decided to make the long trek around the corner to Mrs. Ireland's house and introduce myself. So off I went, limping precariously along the side of the road in a delicate balancing act. Her broad, welcoming smile and crystal blue eyes greeted me like an old friend she hadn't seen for a long time. And from that moment on, Mrs. Ireland and I were inseparable pals. I visited her as often as I could, using the old white house where my new friend lived as my point of destination, and then an eventual stopping off point as my strength gradually increased, allowing me in time to walk further and further down the road in my quest to achieve my goal of walking around the block. With a sharp and clear mind beneath her thick head of white hair, she shared stories of the old days, how nothing had really changed that much in the last 50 years in our neighborhood, she said, every detail resonating precise recollections of past history that embraced her life and remained as real to her now as when it happened decades ago. She was a historian of personal triumph and tragedy, a virtual encyclopedia of knowledge that fascinated me and gripped my attention. But I soon realized that even though family and friends made frequent visits to Mrs. Ireland's house, few could imagine the depth of an instinctive human thirst she had to experience the quality of what simply being outdoors had to offer in the tranquil setting of her own backyard. She longed to be an active part of that again. But without random visitors during the day, she was confined to staying indoors. Well, enough was enough, I thought. So one day, I took her by the arm, and together we hobbled slowly and painstakingly, making our way down the 4 steps of her back porch to the big lawn chairs that waited, having held their place on the edge of her backyard for us. And there we sat, just the 2 of us, a reverent audience to the attention of the potted plants she loved, the giant sago palm her husband planted some 30 years ago, swaying in the salty scent of the sea breeze, and to the sweet sounds of birds chirping from the treetops, all as if to say, hello again, welcoming her back. And that thrilled her senses. And when it came time I no longer had the strength to say, we'd hobble our way back up the porch steps, and I'd leave my friend behind with a glowing expression on her face that reflected both gratitude and satisfaction we both felt that we had achieved great things that day. And we did this as often as our collective strength would allow. "I'll be seeing you," she'd always say as I made my way out the front door. "And I'll be seeing you too, Mrs. Ireland," I'd always say in return. I convinced myself that brilliant ideas come in many forms and can sometimes be executed very creatively. So with that in mind, I set out with a plan to surprise her. And at dusk one evening in October, when the big golden harvest moon began creeping its way over the horizon, I once again stumble-walked to Mrs. Ireland's house, wrapped her in her favorite sweater, and together we hobbled down the steps of her back porch to sit quietly at the end of the day in anticipation of the show that was about to begin. She'd longed to see the full moon in the night sky for years now, and the spectacle was about to crescendo into a magnificent performance that granted her wish. Leaves falling from the tall oaks in unison with the sounds of the soft sea breeze became an orchestra, creating music that set the stage. The giant sago palm bowed gently to the rhythm in anticipation. Then the gray-pink glow on the horizon soon turned dim, and like a magnificent curtain rising, turned to black velvet as stars came out of nowhere, blinking on and off, as if speaking to her soul that understood their language. The glow from the brilliant incandescent light of the moon radiated on Mrs. Ireland's face, and its reflection captured in her crystal blue eyes revealed the beauty of her secret kept in perfect peace and serenity, knowing her goals in life had been reached, her dreams fulfilled at last, even this one here now, sitting outside in her own backyard, watching the October moon dance its way across the night sky overhead in its final performance for her. That would be one of the last times I would see Mrs. Ireland. Her health suddenly began to fail, and she was moved to a nursing home. And not long after that, I learned of her passing. 6 months or so later, I was finally able to achieve my goal of walking around the block for the very first time, and even though I still needed the help of my worn-out cane. And just before turning the corner on my way back home, I paused at what was left of the old dirt road that ran beside Mrs. Ireland's house and stared into the now blank, empty windows, remembering our times together. If I had just one wish, I thought, it would be that I could walk carefree beside her on a warm summer afternoon, carrying our lunch packed in a wicker picnic basket, both of us heading off down the old dirt road as it once used to be, on our way to the beach. But instead, as I turned to go, hoping somehow she could still hear me, I whispered out loud, "I'll be seeing you, Mrs. Ireland. I'll be seeing you." Some of the deepest and most important lessons we learn in life don't always come with great drama and loud noise. Instead, they're the composition and harmony of the smaller things in our daily lives we tend to take for granted. And if we pay attention and observe, those little things will accumulate and grow into giant leaps of eye-opening discoveries and keen awareness of understanding life's grandeur all around us. That's what makes life worth living. Mrs. Ireland taught me that. Until next time, I'm Sue Ellen Dickinson.